welcome to Olympic Cards and Comics ongoing virtual free comic book day. We're being joined now by writer, musician, raconteur, friend of mine, Brandon Jerwa. He's largely believable, so you can take most of this as gospel. Brandon, how are you today?
Fairly credible. I'm gonna have that printed on business cards because we're gonna need those. I'm doing well. I am safely sequestered in Seattle.
Excellent. So we're going to jump in with a handful of questions that we're kind of asking all the creators that have participated today.
Okay.
So we're going to start with some of the basic ones. What was your first comic that you remember reading? What was the first comic you bought with your own money? Like what was the kernel of the mighty oak that you have become? So
Right. Well, I think I was born in 1973, and this informs my answer. I was born in 1973, and I have a very distinct memory of Star Wars #1, of that Marvel book, and needing to have that. But I can't say for sure that was my first comic book. I was fascinated with Spider-Man and Batman very early on, so there's definitely a chance that I had a comic before that. But in terms of memory, being 4 years old, and I mean, I really do genuinely remember this with clarity. I can tell you where I lived, I can tell you where I kept the books, the whole deal, and even I think probably where we got it. But yeah, it's got to be Star Wars #1 is got to be on that list very prominently. So I'm going to say that it was that licensed comic book that started me off.
Excellent. We'll get back to that in a minute, but since you were talking about it had imprinted so much on you that you remember it from when you were 4, and you can remember where you were and where you lived and all that. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. Where are you from? How did that inform your path into comics and so on? Talk about some of the projects you've worked on.
Okay. So I was born in Manhattan, Kansas. I lived in Junction City, Kansas, but Manhattan is where the hospital was. And I share my birthplace with Elvira, which is ironic because I almost worked with her a couple of years ago on a thing that didn't come to fruition. But yeah, so I was born in Manhattan, Kansas, which is divided from Junction City by Fort Riley, Kansas. So I grew up near a military base. My parents were not in the military. My dad was a car salesman, and my mom worked at a bank. So we interacted with the military a lot. My dad sold cars to GIs every day. I guarantee you. And my mom probably helped figure out the financing to get them those cars. So I remember that I bought my first G.I. Joe figure, which would later be very significant, at the Kmart in Manhattan, Kansas. I bought the first record that I ever bought with my own money, which was The Game by Queen at that same Kmart in Manhattan. I bought G.I. Joe #1, the giant oversized G.I. Joe #1 at Alco in Junction City, Kansas. Do you know what an Alco is?
I assume it's a gas station, convenience store kind of thing.
Nope. It's,
all right.
It's more like a tiny Target.
Okay.
Like a smaller department store, and I think
like a Woolworths.
Yeah. Very much like a Woolworths. Incidentally, my dad worked for Woolworths for a while. Yeah, and for me, comics were a thing where my parents, they didn't care what I read as long as I was reading. And I mean, I've said this before many, many times, and it bears repeating. I learned how to read from comic books. Because I wanted to read them. So, side note, if you're a parent, your kid wants to read comic books, and they're not real good at reading, they'll get better if you let them read comics. I promise they will, because they want to know words like electroencephaloenhancer, which is a word I remember wanting to learn how to say. And I remember asking my mom what that was, and my mom's a very smart woman. She said, "Well, let's break it down. Let's break it down into the core components here. You have electroencephaloenhancer, and that's what I would do. Is I would read, and if I hit something I didn't know, which comics are written smartly sometimes, you would run into things you didn't know, and I would ask. And my mom would always take the time to say, yeah, it's this or this, or we'd find out together. So yeah, comic books were an easy in to get me to read, and at 60 cents a pop.
Wow. Okay.
Pretty easy to get away with. My parents would also bring me. I have a box full in storage of digests of newspaper comics like Beetle Bailey and Heathcliff and High and Lois and Broomhilda and all those things. And that's another thing where my parents didn't need to be with me for those. They'd see a new one and they'd buy it and they'd bring it home. So it was comics and it was comic strips. I did read normal books, but yeah.
So was it comics? Was it your introduction to comics that made you eventually realize you wanted to be a storyteller, that you wanted to be a writer?
Yeah, I think so. Once I realized that people wrote them, like, you hit that moment where you're reading a comic or you're watching a TV show and you're like, oh, right, they don't just show up and do this. This has to be created by someone. So yeah, I won the district spelling bee in the 8th grade, and I was a very good speller, still am. Says the guy who makes money as an editor. I won the district spelling bee in Longview, Washington. My parents had divorced. We'd moved to Longview. This is the 8th grade. Now I'm jumping ahead. And I said in the newspaper article, I was getting press even then, that I collected comic books and wanted to write them. So I had made that decision for myself at some point pre-8th grade or in the 8th grade, and decided to tell the local newspaper about it when they talked to me. So I wanted to do this for a very long time, I think. And I knew I couldn't draw. So decision to make.
Yeah, and it's weird that moment. I'm sorry.
I drew all the time, but I knew I was not good at it.
Same. There is that weird moment when you're a kid too, where suddenly you realize, oh wait, people make these. That was a really subversive moment for me when my parents had given me a book, the Smithsonian Book of Comic Book Comics.
I have that book.
Yeah, and it's fantastic. It was my first exposure to like EC War comics and The Spirit and Will Eisner. But the weirdest part was I got obsessed with the bios that prefaced each section that told you about the creator. I was like, wait, that's a job? Oh, that could be my job. I was like 9 when that happened and the die was cast. So yeah, I love that book.
Me too. Oh, and there was a thing in Marvel Comics, like, I don't know, 1982, 83, you might know better than I do, 81, Assistant Editors Month.
Oh my God, yeah. I remember that.
They made a big deal about it. They're like, this month we let the assistant editors take over, and it's all going to be stupid and weird. And it was, in fact, stupid and weird. And it was great. I bought every assistant editor comic I could find. It had a little stamp on it. And I remember, I'm just now remembering this. I remember thinking, maybe I could become an assistant editor at Marvel.
Aim high, brother.
Once a year, I'll get to write one of these weird comics.
That's fantastic.
I did actually think that. Yeah. Wow.
So let's talk about your entry into comics, because that's a fun story.
Yeah.
So how did you break in?
I had been a radio DJ, and this was 1990. No, I'm sorry. It was 1998, but it was 2001. I lost my job, or I quit my job at the radio station because I wasn't making any money. And my wife at the time, yeah, shocking. My wife at the time had gotten a job at ITT Tech in Portland, and we moved. We moved so she could take this job, and we had a fairly newborn kid. So we decided that we would go to Portland. I didn't have a job, and I would watch the kid, find a job, and she would go to work and, be the breadwinner. So I got to Oregon and filed for unemployment for the first time in my life. I'd never done that. And because I'd had a job since I was 10. In some way, shape, or form, I'd always had a job. And we got there, and the state of Oregon said, oh, you're a displaced professional. And I said, what does that mean? And they're like, well, your job doesn't really exist anymore. Radio, right? So you're free to pursue any career you want. And I was like, well, Dark Horse is just down the street. So I think I'd like to become a comic book writer. And the ex-wife said, sure, go for it. She was very supportive. And I realized at that moment that I did not know what a comic book script looked like. So I went to the internet and I found on the Dark Horse website, I found a script template. And so I copied the script template. You know how it is with a format. You just look at it and you just write that until you have it right. So I wrote a superhero book. I don't ever talk about this much. I wrote two things. I wrote a G.I. Joe spec script because Devil's Due had just launched G.I. Joe on September 11th, 2001.
I feel like that was the date.
Yeah.
Ouch.
That is not the day that those books ended up getting into most hands. And I laugh when I say that because we're far enough away now that it's just like, what a horrible timing to launch your new American first terrorist comic. So that was a little bit of a delay, I think, for them. But so I sent an email to Devil's Due very formally. Actually, I think I wrote an actual letter, an actual honest-to-God letter that I mailed. And very much like, I would love to write for your comic. And I do not have any professional experience, but I promise, like it was like I was applying for a job. And they, to my eternal shock, responded and they were like, yeah, sure, send us a script. They were like 2 issues into their run at this point. So I'd written this G.I. Joe script and I sent it off to them. And then I sent this superhero book to Dark Horse. And it's not good. I know that now. I didn't know that then. And Dark Horse, like 3 or 4 months later, I got a very nice, hey, we think you've got some talent, so we're going to keep this on file. But no. We're not going to be purchasing this. And so that was cool. But Devil's Due said yes, and they ended up putting me on an anthology series called G.I. Joe Frontline. I wrote a 2-part story. And they were going to use me as part of the initial offerings, along with Larry Hama and Dan Jolly, no pressure, established actual writers. And so I got into this writers meeting with the publisher, and he said, okay, so we got your 2 parts here. When can you finish the other 2 parts? And I said, what? And they said, well, it's a 4-part story, right? And I went, yep, it sure is. Even though it clearly ends after the 2nd issue, it definitely is a 4-part story. And I didn't let on that it was never meant to be 4 parts. So I went and wrote 2 more parts, which is why the story literally takes a completely, like, it definitely, there's a break point between the 2nd and the 3rd issue. But it's all one story, and it ended up being fine. So I did that, and then they had me rewrite some dialogue for another issue of Frontline written by some TV writers. And then they offered me G.I. Joe. And then that was kind of it. I just kind of came out of nowhere, sold my first thing. And, like Wizard did a little article about me that kind of made me sound like I was a fan who'd won a contest. So I had to shake that a little bit. It wasn't writer gets job. It was lucky fan gets opportunity to write G.I. Joe. So then I did G.I. Joe for a while, became an action figure, did some stuff for Hasbro, and then kind of became the licensed property guy.
Excellent.
And now I am an editor in addition to being a writer, which means I get to push writers around. Some of whom are my friends.
Excellent. I know you haven't hired me, but all right.
Did you want to write that choice-based romance game for NBC Universal?
Sure, we'll do that.
Is that your wheelhouse, Eric?
Obviously, I'm known as the romance guy in certain circles.
I certainly am, so that tracks.
So, of the characters you've written, which one was your favorite to write?
Oh, you know what I'm going to say. I loved writing Vampirella. And I've never quite gotten over... Like, I had a hard time getting over not working on G.I. Joe because I was just G.I. Joe guy for so many years. And to this day, people are still like, when are you going to go back to G.I. Joe? And you just kind of learn to smile and say, oh, I'd go back anytime. Vampirella, it started with you. Dynamite bought Vampirella, like just bought her property-wise, right?
Yep.
And you did it. And I loved old Vampirella, and I definitely was familiar with sort of 90s Vampirella. although it wasn't something I actively read. And then you were working on that and read Sonia, and they came to me and said, I don't know, did I do an annual first or a fill-in issue?
You did one issue for me because I had also been tapped at that point to write Flash Gordon.
Right.
So, and it was like, oh yeah, and it was a standard Dynamite job. It was like, oh yeah, we needed this last week before we hired you, and I couldn't do that month's Vampirella and still get #1 of Flash Gordon out the door, and that's when I think you got the nod. It was issue 7. Was it issue 7?
Yeah, I think so.
7 or 11, I can't remember, but
it's 11. It was definitely 11. It was definitely 11, and then I did an annual, and then I came on with issue 23, right?
Yep.
And stayed till 43, which incidentally is also the duration of my G.I. Joe run.
Ha!
I came on at 23 and left at 43 when the series ended and a new relaunch happened. I'm pretty sure I have those numbers right. And if I don't, well, I'm very sorry. But
it's
there was
the internet; they'll let you know.
Yeah. I actually just told this story on a podcast recently, but there was a really great sort of period of time where you and I and Mark Ronner were all working on Vampirella at the same time. And like Mark would like call me. He's like, hey, I want to use Criswell. And I'd call you and say, hey, I'm doing this. What are you doing? How are you wrapping this up? And like me and my two pals were in charge of this comic book universe for a minute. And it was fantastic. But yeah, I weirdly I fell in love with Vampirella, like as a character and writing her, and I just love her because you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And our editor Joe, bless him, let me do whatever I wanted. Really, like I want to make this a space superhero romance horror time travel book, and he's like, okay.
Yeah, that was the fun thing about Vampirella, because I took a much harder, for lack of a better term, more realistic take on her. But your run pulled out all of the stops and was all the crazy cosmic, Lords of Chaos and Order stuff and the UFOs. And it was like, no, they very comfortably exist in the same universe.
Yeah.
That's very, very cool.
Well, and Kurt Busiek is going to get a little blame for anybody who didn't like that, because I had dinner with Kurt one night. I was actually at a group dinner at somebody's house in Portland, and I was talking to Kurt, and I had to go kiss the ring, and I'd just been given Vampirella. And I said, Kurt, what's a great thing that I can pull out of obscurity, and what would be a thing that you think would be great to see more of in Vampirella? And he said these weird characters, Quark and Starpatch, and the whole weird space crew. And I took them and probably used them too much. Like they became Vampirella's Enterprise crew. So yeah. Also, incidentally, Vampirella and Mighty Crusaders, 2 different books that you and I both worked on, where both books end with a character ostensibly going off into another reality. So.
You're right. We were kind of one note. Okay, so follow up. What's the character book that you would most like the opportunity to work on? I think I know the answer to this one too.
Wait, hold on. I'm going to just go ahead and let you say what you think it is.
You've been obsessing about Rom the entire time I've known you, so I'm thinking Rom.
I'm kind of over Rom. I mean, I guess
the internet just broke.
I know. I guess I would still like to do it because he is one of my favorite characters of all time. But I connect with the older stuff now. No reflection on the newer stuff, but my heart is in that older stuff, and I'm not sure that magic can ever be quite captured again.
Fair enough. So
for me as a fan,
sure. So what is the character or book you would most like to work on?
Well, you mentioned that you worked on Flash Gordon, and there was this very, very brief moment where there were conversations that you would write Flash Gordon and I would write the Phantom. And I think we all know how magical that could have ended up being. although it did result in King's Watch, which was great and I loved.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd really love to get my mitts on the Phantom still. Yeah, very much.
So what's your elevator pitch? You got one?
It's the Phantom.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean, like, that's it. It's the Phantom. Oh, another thing I'd like to do, and there's nothing stopping me from doing this, and I've wanted to do this for a long time. I have, for a very, very long time, wanted to do Dracula as Highlander. And have a Dracula series that follows Dracula through history and not just the same time periods we always see him in. Like, I want to see Dracula in the 70s punk scene in New York. And I want to see Dracula during the Spanish Inquisition. And I want to see Egyptian archaeologist Dracula. And, like, that's what I want. And, like, sort of anti-hero. I would really like to do that. And, again, nothing stopping me.
I would really like to read that, so get on that, will you?
Sure. Why not? Because making comics is super easy.
It is.
You don't need any other component except a story. That's all it requires, Eric. As you know, you don't need an artist or an inker or a colorist or a publisher or an editor, and you don't need them all to be reliable and available and affordable. So, again, you can just sit down and make it happen, and I think I will as soon as we're done here.
Excellent.
Do I sound sarcastic? I don't mean to come across sarcastic.
A little bit.
Oh, okay.
So, what are you currently reading? Are you still reading comics here in the age of quarantine?
I am. I'm reading old comics though. I'm reading a lot of old comics. I've been reading some old Avengers, some old Marvel Team Up. I would really like to go back and read all the Spider-Mans from the 80s. Like, I'd love to go back to that, reading Amazing Marvel Team Up and Spectacular Spider-Man all at the same time kind of thing. I also miss the days. Do they still do this? Oh, boy. I said, boy. Grandpa has a question.
Okay, Pop, what do you need?
Do they still do the thing where the story starts in Detective Comics and then it continues in the Batman book?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I it's been a while. I was thinking the other day about Black Mask and how when Black Mask first debuted, he was a completely different character. Mm-hmm. But he, it was one of those started in Detective, ended up in Batman things, and I always found that terrifically exciting when you could potentially walk into a store and just happen to catch both parts on the shelf.
Yeah. Yeah. No, they still do crossovers.
Hey, hold on. What about you? What's the character you want to write?
It's changed. Like, if we're talking mainstream character, for the longest time, it was Superman. I mean, I know you know this story, but obviously we're talking for an audience, not just, chewing the fat.
Tell this story, Eric.
The first comic I bought with my own money was an issue of Superman in the hospital gift shop where my grandfather was dying. So I'm going to bring the room down for a minute. Sure. Don't worry. It ends on a high note. And it was, I forget the issue number. I'd have to look it up. But the villain of the piece was Carl Draper, the master jailer. And he built, a Supermax prison, Carl had, and was handing it over as his gift to Metropolis. And, of course, Superman shows up. And as Superman has done to poor Carl Draper since they grew up together in Smallville, is like, he shows up and makes it even better and sort of takes credit for it. So he takes a Supermax prison that can hold all these metahuman criminals and puts it in a, impenetrable dome and puts anti-grav skids on it and hoists it into the sky. And instead of being called Draper's Island, Lois, in Lois fashion, names it Superman's Island. And that's when Carl snaps. He's had enough. And starts trying to take down Superman and traps him in the prison. And it was a great little one shot. And I always loved the Carl Draper character because, to be honest, like, he's a smart guy. He's got good intentions. Then every time he does something cool, Superman shows up, puts the S logo on it and takes credit.
Right.
But
he's like Gene Simmons with that logo, right?
Yeah, kinda. Oh man! Now I see the KISS logo with the Superman S's. But part of what I took from that is, I was probably, when was this? I was like 9 or 10. It was about 10. And, I got fascinated by Superman, and in the context of this first issue and where I bought it, it was sort of like, Superman's there. He's there to help. It was very important to me at a time where I was mourning my grandfather and all that. So that's a character I always kind of wanted to do, and then got to write Action Comics, but in the period where Superman wasn't in it. Without trying to bring the room down, the working for DC kind of cured me of wanting to write Superman. Just the environment at the time was not conducive to anyone doing not even their best work or even just good work. So it took a lot of room off.
Whatever do you mean? I don't know, Eric.
Dan already lost his job. I don't want to kick him while he's down. That's that. But the nice part, like I said, this ends on a somewhat higher note. My first DC comic was an issue of Checkmate that I was being tried out on under Greg Rucka's supervision, and the primary character of the piece was Carl Draper, reformed supervillain who has decided he's tired of every time he puts on a pair of tights getting punched in the face by Superman, and he's going to go work for the government. So I got to pay a little homage to that first issue. So that was, I don't know. So the character I most want to write, I have a creator-owned thing that I'm developing with Pete Woods that I can't talk too much about because obviously I don't want to jinx it.
Sure.
But it's a kind of Victorian, slightly steampunk occult adventure story, and the main character of that is the one I'm most interested in diving into right now. Ask me tomorrow, that'll change. That's like, which child do you love the most? Well. So let's see. I think I've only got a couple more questions here. You say you're mostly reading older books now. In your opinion, is there an older title or a current title that you think is under most people's radar and deserves more attention?
Captain Carrot and His Amazing Zoo Crew.
Well, that took a lot of deliberation.
No, it's joyous, and I I'm not a big funny animal comic kind of guy, but I had every issue of Captain Carrot and His Amazing Zoo Crew, and ended up losing all of those issues I through whatever means I don't know. Only later to have an entire run of that same series left in a laundry room of an apartment building I lived in with a sign that said free, so I took them and once again had a complete collection of Captain Carrot and His Amazing Zoo Crew. So yeah, I think that more people should read Captain Carrot because one, it's fun, it's funny, it's light, it's enjoyable, and there are some really weird pop culture jokes in there that if you're a latchkey kid in the 80s, you were able to pick up on.
Okay.
But I don't know that the average kid would necessarily respond to.
All right. Excellent.
Now that we're all old and have, the power of reminiscence.
Here at the end of our lives, yeah.
Yeah. I'm wearing glasses to show that time has passed. But yeah, that'd be a recommendation I would definitely hand out.
Excellent.
And the Jack Kirby Superpowers series.
Oh, all right. That's a deep cut. Well done. I like that one.
A marketing item at best, a response to Secret Wars, a way to back up the amazing action figure line. But it's a super cool Jack Kirby Saturday morning cartoon because it's one of those situations where you've got all these heroes and it's very sort of G.I. Joe plot where there's multiple problems across the world and they have to split up the team and go each face them individually so that they can stop the thing from being built or the thing from being opened or the creature from being summoned. And it's all your favorite heroes and, Jack Kirby, pretty good. Good.
Kid had chops for sure. Is there a piece of your work that challenged you the most as a creator? Tell me about the hardest gig. And I suspect I know the answer to this one too. I want to go on record as saying these were questions that we are asking everyone.
Sure.
So
They just happen to be a little front loaded for me.
A little bit.
Well, one, I will sidestep the obvious answer because we'll get to that in a second. But one, I did get hired to adapt a Dean Koontz novel. I have literally no idea if this ever came out. I have no clue. I will tell you that there is nothing in the comics industry on paper that I have done a worse job with. It may not have come out, and it may have been my fault. I don't know. Maybe it was brilliant and I couldn't recognize it, but I was so out to sea with that I absolutely. But halfway up the hill, I realized, I haven't reached the hill yet.
Oh, that's always a good feeling.
Oh, God, terrible, absolutely terrible. And no reflection on the book. I just was ill-equipped to handle that task.
Adaptation is tough in general, and then adaptation into comics, where you, that's literary adaptation into comics is not a thing I think I ever want to do.
Yeah.
Tempted briefly when Dynamite was starting up doing literary adaptations of the Ian Fleming Bond novels, because if nothing else, they're simple and they're short.
Yep.
But yeah, that is a thankless task. Yeah.
So obviously, Shooters was very, very difficult for a multitude of reasons.
Let's interject really quickly for people who don't know, and based on the sales, I'm going to assume most people don't know.
Seems safe.
Yeah, Shooters was an original graphic novel that Brandon and I co-wrote for DC Vertigo, illustrated by the excellent Steve Lieber. It was a contemporary military drama set in the early days of the Second Iraq War, and follows a soldier through a friendly fire incident and trying to reintegrate and recuperate in his personal life, and then going back to war as a private military contractor. And it was a tough piece of work to write. Carry on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. That's all correct. That all checks out. But yeah, so here's this thing that you created, was based in fact, based in personal fact, required a lot of real world accuracy. Was the big call up to the majors, DC Vertigo, no slouch. My wife at the time had just been through a horrible accident, and a lot of things came out of that. Actually, I had real firsthand experience with having an injured person in my care and in my presence, and it was you. Once it finally came out, and it was done, and we had this beautiful art, and everything's great. We had a big event, we had a big launch party, and there's a sea of camouflage coming in and out of the store. Soldiers lining up to get this book, and they're thanking us, and we're trying to thank them. And you and I in turns had to have a few moments of walking away. I was crying a few times, where I just was the pressure of it all was just too much. And then we were on NPR, and it just was everywhere, and it all encompassing. And then we won a Prism Award, just wildest dreams. Did nothing for our careers, which is fine. Because no, and this is true, and I will say this, and it sounds like false sincerity. I don't know what it sounds like, but if somebody had said, well, you don't get to do comics anymore after that, I'd be like, well, you know what? Then I did my best, and that's fine. But it was this weird explosion, and then it was just done.
Yeah. And
still the best thing I've ever worked on by a country mile, and I can take very little credit for that. So thanks for inviting me along.
Sure. Misery loves company, man.
Let's never do that again.
Exactly.
Or if we do, let's figure out a way to keep it a little lighter, because no part of that was not heavy.
No. I do have an idea for a follow-up, actually.
Great.
We can talk about that later. And it's much lighter. But I believe I have reached the end of my required questions. So I'm going to move on to you. And in fact, Brandon thoughtfully provided us with the music that we're using as our intro and outro for these videos. So thank you for that.
I hope you only mildly hate hearing
it. What was the first band? Was it Omnivox?
No, the first band was okay. So in high school I had a band, and we were pretty serious. We got around, we played some gigs. We were using keyboards that belonged to the Mark Morris High School choir. There were two synthesizers in the back room, and we asked if we could use them, and we ended up having our own band rehearsal space. My first band was called, are you ready? Are you ready? This, like, telling you the name of my first band is almost a gift from me to you. It was Greenhouse Affection. And that's Greenhouse with an H-A-U-S. Because it wasn't ostentatious enough. We really had to lean into that. So
you got my birthday covered. That's fantastic.
Yeah, you're welcome. I hope it fits. So there was Greenhouse Affection, and that didn't last because that's a high school band, and that doesn't last. Right. And then I had a band called Relay with two chaps from Joplin, Missouri. I was living in Kansas City at the time. One of those chaps was Craig Jones, who I am currently making music with now.
Later is the name of the band, correct?
Yeah. And then there was SD6 and Omnibox and Back into the Left and Hibernaut. I've played a lot of music, and these aren't just imaginary bands. Like, I've played shows as these bands. But now I have Later Humans, which my poor beleaguered art director, Eric Trautmann, and the hardworking staff at Fedora Monkey, they do, it's just him. Pop the illusion here, but it's just him and a cat.
You've destroyed the magic, Brandon.
The magic is intact, Eric. I promise you it is. Anyway, so Later Humans, I've been working. We have one track on a Transformers soundtrack tribute album, Respect the Prime. So since that time, I have been sitting on literal hours worth of music that I have not had the confidence to release. Eric's heard a lot of it.
And it's good.
Thank you. I spent the last year living in LA, where I teamed up with a Seattle musician named Dre Robinson, aka The Data Bomb, who is a mainstay of the Seattle electro-industrial scene, and now is, in Los Angeles. And he currently mixing 4 songs. We have an EP that we're putting together. We're going to release them as individual tracks on Bandcamp to start off with. And yeah, that's it. It's ambient electronic music. I mean, I've spent a lot of time singing. I'm a decent singer. I'm an okay songwriter, but I just kind of wanted to, I'm about to say something horribly pretentious. I just wanted to speak with music rather than singing. I'm having a difficult time, I guess, directing words musically. And for a long time, I was letting that stop me, and that's kind of stupid. So, I'm doing sort of atmospheric electronic dance music under the name Later Humans. You can find us on Facebook because we're cutting edge with the social media. And we should have our first song up within the next 2-3 weeks, I'm hoping. It's working very hard. I heard some very big 808 drum machine beats yesterday that I was very pleased with. So I'm very much looking forward to it. The art design is impeccable.
Well, I mean, obviously that's going to sell it, but
sure. It's going to have to. So that's great. So please watch for that on Bandcamp.
Fantastic. So where did the interest in music start? Like, do you have any formal training or?
No. Like anything else, I am only ever successful completely by accident. Music was like, again, I mean, it goes back to my parents. There was always music. Like there were records and tapes at home. There was an 8-track player in the car. And my parents had a great wide taste in music in the 70s, because in the 70s were kind of like the 90s in that all the music bled together after a while and everybody kind of liked everything, right? So like I would hear Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton, and then I'd hear Tom Petty and Janis Joplin and Rare Earth and The Police. The first time I ever heard the album Ghost in the Machine, it's because my parents bought it. The Police ended up being, one of my favorite bands of all time. And yeah, so I grew up with music all around, and I just always liked to sing. And I was very sad. I was very sad when Kenny Rogers died.
Yeah.
Because that was like The Gambler might have been the first song I knew all the words to. Besides the, itsy bitsy spider type stuff. Right. But like I have very distinct memories of always wanting to sing along with Kenny Rogers songs. I could do that greatest hits album front to back.
I distinctly remember when Coward of the County and The Gambler were both like crushing the charts and dominating radio where I grew up. Yeah, it was. That was a time where, the format. What's a format? We're gonna play whatever. So
yeah. Well, and that also that's how I became interested in radio. And in fact, we had a radio station in Junction City, Kansas called KJCK. Real clever. And my mom's friend Novella, a German woman, she was a cleaning lady. That was what she did for a living, and she would clean the radio station. And she would take me with her. And I got to like sit in on the air. Like they'd see me and they'd just bring me in the booth, and they would give me the big, I don't know if people know this, but when radio shows on the weekends, especially the ones on the weekends, like the countdown shows, those kinds of things, those would come on records or reels or carts, because they were going to stations all over the country. And they would give me these big boxes of these countdown shows. I had these, I wish I still had them, gigantic boxes of country records. It was not a country station, so I don't know why maybe that's why they were giving them to me. But they would give me these big boxes that were countdown shows. So I had all these archived countdown shows. And that was pretty cool. So yeah, I got to see that, and it looked exactly like WKRP, which also made me want to be a radio DJ. So yeah, I mean, I guess very early on, for the most part, with the exception of the fact that I didn't actually see a comic book store until I was 11 years old because we didn't have one, I was kind of shown the path to all my influences and all the things I would end up doing, and maybe that's why.
Well, thank you very much, Brandon. I appreciate you participating in our Free Comic Book Day virtual style.
Yes, happy Free Comic Book Day to everybody. Please pick up some comics for kids. Make sure you do that if you're not getting some for your own. If you know a kid, they could probably really use some comics right now. And also, I'm going to say this because I want to make sure it gets said, and I know it's going to make you deeply uncomfortable, but I have to really applaud Gabby and you for finding a way to take a place that is the hub of the community, and in a time when you literally cannot be the hub of the community, still figuring out a way to be the hub of the community. You've been doing very great things, and I know you shy away from praise at every turn, and that's why I love you, but you guys are really doing great things, and I hope that people are aware of what you're doing, and that, I hope they know that you're doing it because you genuinely love people, and that's to be commended.
You're blowing my cover, man.
I know, and if you edit this out, I will haunt you for the rest of your days. So leave it in.
Fair enough. All right. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
You too.